This is this week's Radio Times, November 20th, 2023 as we speak, and this is the Radio Times for this week, 100 years ago. It's one of my most prized possessions. It's the 8th edition of the Radio Times, and it's 100 years old this week. So I've got a bit of time in the car, and I thought here, as part of the British Broadcasting Century Project, you're very welcome to it, explore the podcast, we'd compare and contrast, although mostly I'll leave you to read that one on your own. We'll have a look at what was on the air 100 years ago this very week. So, let's have a quick look then, shall we? I mean, first of all, I wanted to point out a couple of things here. From the very top, the masthead of the Radio Times here. The Radio Times notice. Nowadays, we've lost the definite article of just Radio Times. But the Radio Times. Firstly, you've got the transmitting masts here of all of the different stations around the country. You've got Birmingham, Cardiff, Bournemouth, London, Newcastle, Aberdeen, Glasgow, Cardiff. Something I'd not fully clocked for a while before was that actually supporting it up here, you've got these two sort of aerials, and you've got you've got the masts and the aerial slung between them, which was a common aerial at the time. You've got the wonderful BBC logo here. There you go. That's the you'd find that exact logo stamped on your radio set if it's an official type approved one. This is the official organ of the BBC. It cost you 2p. The new version is £4.50. A little bit more, that's inflation for you. Every Friday, this one now is every Tuesday, registered by the GPO as a newspaper. Official programmes of the British Broadcasting Company for the week commencing Sunday, November the 18th. So it was a Sunday to Saturday schedule at this point. So first of all, let's have a look at the cover article here by John Reith. What's in the Air by the General Manager of the BBC. Walking home along Whitehall at 8:30 the other evening, I noticed a little old woman hesitating on the curb opposite the Cenotaph. She was shabbily clad in the style of perhaps 30 years ago. So 30 years from before 1923, 1893. Good math, Paul, well done. In her hand was what appeared to be a fragment of newspaper. When eventually the traffic permitted, she crossed to the monument in which is centred so much of national pride and remembrance. Bear in mind, this is only just after the First World War, so the Cenotaph, newly built at this point. Her steps at first had been rapid, though there seemed something of an air of furtiveness in her mission. Near the flower-decked pavement, she stopped altogether. With a hesitating hand, she removed the newspaper covering. In the distance, I saw that it had concealed a little bunch of chrysanthemums. Opposite where she had stopped were some large and magnificent floral tributes, crosses, wreaths, and so on. I do not know what came into her mind, but anyway, in the act of stooping to place a humble tribute on the steps, she passed. Then, after a moment or two, she disappeared from sight. Around the corner of the memorial, perhaps it was to seek a spot where her offering would not appear dwarfed and insignificant. I mention this here because I saw it a few hours after we had been refused permission to broadcast the service at the Cenotaph on November the 11th. I've been endeavouring to fathom the causes attendant on this decision, and if possible to appreciate in all sincerity the attitude of mind which led to it. The decision came from those in whose care the Cenotaph is. One respects the motives which doubtless produced it. One wonders, however, whether the reasons annexed, whatever they may be, would be considered valid by the generality of listeners. This was the same year where the royal wedding between the Queen Mother and the future King of England was not allowed to be broadcast. The royals were behind it, but the Dean of Westminster said no, because people could be listening to this church service in pubs with their hats on. And you can't guarantee what position, what attitude listeners will have at home. Will they have an act of reverence? And they thought that here with the Cenotaph. I found a document from 5 years later when they did finally allow the armistice service and the Cenotaph to be broadcast 5 years later in 1928, and the reasons given were that actually it's a place you go to. It's meant to be a sort of a pilgrimage, really. You're meant to go to the Cenotaph to be part of it there live in person. Listening in at home, therefore, reduces the how important that is, the significance of attendance. So there was that element, and also they didn't want to get bulky microphones and cables to be the centre of attention. 5 years later, the microphones had shrunk, and therefore they did finally allow it. So what else have we got? He goes on in more in that article, but we'll move on for a brief moment then and see what else we have going on here. If broadcasting is a national service, our function is revealed on such occasions as these, says Reith. This was nothing to mar the solemnity or order of the ceremony. The process is inconspicuous. It is in no manner of sense to be regarded as a broadcasting stunt. Such would be an outrage on decency where feelings are peculiarly sensitive. Innumerable families in innumerable distant towns whose homes were touched by war could have shared almost personally in what is one of the most impressive and significant national occasions of the year. The striking of the hour on Big Ben, the service itself, all would have been heard from Caithness to Cornwall. So anyway, that's how Reith concludes that particular article from there. What else we got going on? He says inside here, Reith continues on a different matter. They're talking about simultaneous broadcasting. There's a note on the front about simultaneous broadcasting. Where is it here? The Problems of SB by Chief Engineer P.P. Eckersley, of whom we've talked plentifully about on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. It notes his station directors have been informed the number of simultaneously broadcast musical events which are to incorporate in their programmes is to be decided by the consensus of opinion in their area. In other words, local autonomy, so to speak. But that at least one concert per week is to be taken from London or elsewhere. They will naturally include more items if these are acceptable locally. From approximately 3,000 communications received here, we find a 20-to-1 majority in favour of relays. In other words, relaying what was on one station to the others. Because at this point, the BBC is still really a local organisation, a collection of local radio stations. But this was the first time of saying centralisation. London knows best. You will have the London concert. And yeah, they said that people actually wanted that because you could get the London concerts, the London orchestras, the London stars, the London performers elsewhere. But, you know, it dwarfs what's on locally. And I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions as to any relevance of that today. We're to make an experiment at an early date with a new feature altogether, a trial by jury. That's quite exciting. Some well-known people are to participate in this. A good deal of amusement should result. Yeah, like in all juries. The whole thing will, of course, be specially compiled for the occasion. Not a real court case, Reith is telling us there. On Monday, November the 26th, the BBC will make an experimental transmission solely for amateur wireless experts of the United States. At 3 a.m, the 8 stations of the company will be linked by an automatic relaying system, the programme from 2LO being sent out simultaneously from all stations. Each station will then, after a short interval, send out a programme on its own wavelength, so communicating over the Atlantic for the first time. We'll move on through. So events of the week. You've got Sunday, November the 18th is Schumann Evening in Cardiff. November the 19th is Wagner Evening in London, and that's going to be simultaneously broadcast to all stations. Tuesday the 20th of November is All Russian Night in London, while in Cardiff they're broadcasting A Midsummer Night's Dream, so one of the earlier Shakespeare's, I suppose, full-length Shakespeare's. The first one was in May that year, but Cardiff leading the way with full-length performances, especially. Love a bit of Shakespeare and a bit of opera. What else they got? Birmingham on the 21st November has Cavalleria Rusticana by Mascagni, and Manchester will have Pagliacci the same night. Newcastle that evening has Grieg Night. So there you go, Grieg's Brahms' third racket, isn't it? I was thinking of someone else. Thursday the 23rd of November, 2nd of November, sorry. London has the Band of the Royal Air Force simultaneously broadcast to all stations. So Reith had said only 2 paragraphs up, 1 London concert per week. He said at least, but already we got 2 concerts this week being simultaneously broadcast from London. Occasionally local stations did simultaneous broadcasting around, but London certainly had the majority of those. 23rd November, Aberdeen, programme devoted entirely to the works of modern British composers. And on Saturday the 24th of November, La Traviata, Act 1, simultaneously broadcast from London to Manchester and Glasgow. So then you've got some nice little articles by stars of the day, that sort of thing. There's an attempt at a joke here. Would you like to hear a joke? A man wanted to speak on the telephone to the parcels office at a railway station. "Is that the parcels office?" he inquired when he heard a girl's voice over the wire. "No," she replied sweetly. "I'm the goods." Okay, so there you go. I think there's a bit of innuendo going on there. Funny stories told by listeners. I'm resting the magazine down here because you can see it's a little bit torn. It's a little old. It's 100 years old this week. In recent issues of the Radio Times, readers were asked to send accounts of funny things they'd heard in connection with wireless. The following is a further selection. When my son, aged 9, was listening one night, an announcer said, "1 minute, please." A moment later, this statement was corrected by, "2 minutes, please." Upon hearing this, my son excitedly exclaimed, Fancy, I've been listening for 3 minutes and half a second. So says W.F. Dennis of Watford. What else do we have here? Anything? Children's Hour. I invited a little boy to listen the other evening during Children's Hour. After listening for some time, he said, "Where do the voices come from?" "That's the uncle talking to the little boys and girls from London," I replied. "Oh," he exclaimed, "but where are the little boys and girls? There's only me here." Mrs. F.J. Wayland of London. So then you've got Peter Eckersley. He does an article called "The Problems of SB." So my first article was on simultaneous broadcasting. "Do not think that I've exhausted all my subjects, that I must begin again, flog a worn-out horse and never turn to fresh wood and pastures new. But much has been said and written and thought about simultaneous. Some in the provinces hail the addition to their local programmes with delight. Some refer to a chaos of horrible noise rattling the loudspeaker in a travesty of music. Others speak darkly of the thin end of the wedge economy. Let us make the situation clear. Simultaneous is all right in the main. There are two causes that militate against immediate perfection. The lines are variable. The apparatus is not yet perfectly adapted." He goes on to be rather technical, but there you have it. There's a cartoon here about someone posting a letter to the BBC asking the aunties and uncles to give him a birthday wish on the air. We've got words here of a talk broadcast from London by John Merchant. We've got advert here for the Marconi phone. The Marconi phone. Can you see the... here we go. The Marconi phone. Buy your Marconi phone from your Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company Limited. Marconi House, The Strand, WC2. People in the programmes gossip about artists and others. Gossip, eh? Gossip. Elsie Cochrane, who sings at the London station, has appeared at many of the leading musical centres of Europe with marked success, including Paris, Munich, Berlin, Vienna and Elberfeld. Good to know. Well done, you. Mr. Robert D. Strangeways is one of Newcastle's most promising singers. We're glad to hear it. George Parker, well-known baritone. Just saying, really lots of singers. The Farnworth Wesley Male Voice Choir. Stephen Williams, bass baritone. Robert Murray, who broadcasts from Glasgow, tells an amusing story. Oh, this will be fun. Concerning a married man who was not feeling very well. His wife suggested he should consult the doctor. When he returned, she asked how he'd got on. "Not very well," was his reply. "The doctor says I've got a syncopated heart." "Oh, that's terrible," she cried. "That sounds dreadful. Let's see what it means in the dictionary." So she looked it up and said, "Oh, aye, John, the doctor's diagnosed you right enough. Syncopated, moving quickly from one bar to another." Oh, that's good. I like that. One bar to another. He's a drunk, you see. He's a lush. Evelyn Berry singing to Manchester audiences. It's all very local. So Ernest Sharp, he's a popular favourite in Newcastle, whose violin playing is highly appreciated by listeners. He started playing the violin a little boy. That's very nice indeed, isn't it? And as showing what a musical reputation he had even in his school days, Mr. Sharp tells an amusing story. A new and rather exacting master was taking the class in chemistry. He did not get from young Sharp ready answers to his questions. Ready answers to his questions. At last, getting annoyed, the master asked him, "Is there anything you can do?" Before Sharp could reply, the whole of the rest of the class answered in chorus, "Yes, sir, you can play the fiddle." A little joke. Anyway, shall we see what was on today? Right, 100 years ago today. Another advert from, this is Western Electric this time. You want to buy your radio sets and loudspeakers from Western Electric. Of course, the first radio sets, you'd be mostly listening on headphones, so the loudspeaker, this is a new development. Or maybe you prefer the Amplion at the All-British Wireless Exhibition, White City in Shepherd's Bush. There we go. Jaunty fellow. Right, 100 years ago today, it's the 20th of November. This was on then. In London, I won't do everything. But in London, you're at Women's Hour at 5 o'clock, Autumn Furnishing by Mrs. Gordon Stables, The American Woman at Home by Ms. Kathleen Corlander. Wee Willie Tingletoes is the children's story by Mrs. Vernon Bell. So that's rather nice. And then you've got Russian Night from 7:30, as I think I mentioned earlier. You've got singers doing like, you've got a soprano singing Rimsky-Korsakov. Ripsy-Korsakov, you could say, but it's a little bit much for 1923. Birmingham, they've got Kitty's Corner, a talk on tides and the moon, they've got the news bulletin, but they've also got William Bates with the unofficial news bulletin. Must be a comedian. If you enjoy videos like this, by the way, do join us on Patreon Patreon.com/Paul Carenza, because I put videos up there at least once a month, often twice a month. Not necessarily reading from the Radio Times, but similarly geeky old things about old radio. So Patreon.com/Paul Carenza all supports the podcast, £5 a month, and it pays web hosting and old copies of the Radio Times, old books, archive visits and the like. Bournemouth Station, they've got a chat on music by Philip Wilson, the tenor. The Savoy Orpheans. Oh, that's a simultaneous broadcast from London. I was thinking Savoy Hill, London. That's where that's coming from. Yeah, Shakespeare Night in Cardiff. They're doing A Midsummer Night's Dream by the Cardiff Station Dramatic Company, including Betty Morgan, Margaret Wensley, Haydee Gunn, Cyril Escourt, Frank Nichols, Ivor Thomas, Sidney Evans and Cyril Brett. I'm sure you wanted to know those names. But there you go. We're looking to see if Arthur Corbett Smith was involved, because he was the station director, often got stuck in, but he's not in that one. Well, this is interesting. See if the rest of it isn't. 9:45 that evening, you have Lord Montague of Bewley doing a simultaneous broadcast from London, apparently. Yes, the Right Honourable Lord Montague of Bewley, KCIE CSI, the well-known authority on road matters, a talk on roads. Now, I'm going to take a picture of that and send it to the editor of the Radio Times, because the head of archives at the Radio Times is the current Lord Bewley. So there you go. That's kind of cool then, that the 100 years ago today, other Lord Bewley, other different person, was on the air doing a talk on roads. That's quite fascinating. Anyway, Manchester has Victor Smythe, very popular Victor Smythe, broadcaster, one of the first broadcasters from Manchester. Apparently used to come in wearing these big fur coats and things like that, like a famous actor. He was on the air with some humour, and Jesse Cormack was playing solo pianoforte. I wondered if our friend Jude Montague, if your grandfather Sidney is playing, but I can't see him here, not today. Captain H.G. Bell is doing some stuff for the kids, Northumbrian Legends. And finally, Newcastle, 100 years ago today, you've got orchestral works and yeah, mostly just little songs really here and there. Son of the Desert, that's nice. Farmer's Corner, I didn't know they had Farmer's Corner. 6:45 is Farmer's Corner. So that's rather nice. We'll leave it at that, I think. The listings go on. And at the very back here, then you've got, just to give another little flavour at the end of it all, you've got wireless competition results. They have a little competition. They've got other people's opinions. More adverts. Children's Corner, conducted by Uncle Caractacus. That's Cecil Lewis to you and me. A letter from Humpty Dumpty. Hello, children. I promised you something from Uncle Edgar, who's the Birmingham station director, and Uncle Humpty Dumpty. Now, he's the Manchester children's presenter, didn't I? Well, here it is. Not quite something from Uncle Edgar, but about him, which is just as exciting, because all of you up in Birmingham want to know about 5IT and what goes on behind the microphone, don't you? Someone has written this little picture of Uncle Edgar in the kiddies hour. That's rather nice. Well, let's have a quick look at this then. Before he has been sitting at ease in front of the microphone for many seconds, he has caught the atmosphere. It is the merest nonsense to suppose he lacks personal contact with his vast family, in other words, the listeners, the nieces and nephews, you know. One almost expects to be able to see the nephews and nieces through the microphone, or to discover them suddenly tumbling out of it into the studio, drawn by the magic of this Pied Piper of Birmingham. Well, old chap, did you manage to make that ship with your Meccano after all? Why not bring it for me to see? You will. Thanks so much. Saturday at 2:30 then. And suddenly Uncle Edgar observes there's a dearth of uncles and aunties, aside from Uncle Joe, who's wandering around trying to plan his orchestra, soloists and chorus for a later operatic performance into a totally inadequate space. Uncles and aunties are there none. So they kind of, uncles and aunts, the people they just gather from the offices, put them on the air, go, tell a story, tell a joke, play a thing for the kids. So yeah, he's saying to the kids on the air, did you get that Meccano set built? You can come and show it to us, because they would have events. You could go and meet the uncles and the aunts at town hall events and big squares and things like that. And you could go, and it was an interactive sort of thing. Uncle Edgar, his grandson, Percy Edgar's grandson, is David Edgar, the well-known playwright. So there you go, who's working today and tirelessly does work for the Writers Guild. Thank you, David Edgar, for that. So there's a bit more then about Uncle Edgar in Birmingham. Auntie Gladys, she's one of the popular ones there in Birmingham. 2ZY Kiddies, that's Manchester. I'm so excited to having the chance to talk to you again. It seems such a long time ago when I used to perch on the patent valve socket that Uncle... Anyway, blah, 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 it goes on. So, I'll show you a photograph. This was sent in by A. Corbett, 48 Baker Street, London. First prize for the most artistic photograph in the BBC Brighter Britain competition. BBC Brighter Britain competition. There's the photo of listening there to the radio set. In pyjamas in bed, so that's nice with his little toys. So, yeah, that page then goes on about that. And then you've got letters from listeners. Dear sir, a glance at the names of the BBC's announcers gives one the impression that it's a board of boxing control. One finds a Corbett, a Palmer, a Smith, a Lewis and a Honeyman. All names of boxers, presumably. It makes it topical. Final thing here, let's just read you this. I say final, it won't be, you know me. MP speeches on tap. A correspondent to the Evening Standard protests against the suggestion that the proceedings of Parliament should be broadcast to the country. Oh, should you broadcast Parliament? There is humour, he writes, in the assumption that parliamentary proceedings are so absorbingly interesting they must be wirelessed. Oh, good verb, wirelessed. Broadcast. Aired, whatever. Are stodgy speeches mercifully withheld from the public and frequently delivered in a more or less empty house to be thrust on owners of receiving sets? So, you know, people found it boring, but wait for the BBC Parliament channel. Much might be said in favour of some important speech being broadcast at times from Parliament, but even here the newspaper has an advantage because, unlike the broadcasting apparatus, it's able to omit non-essential matter that makes a speech unduly long. So it's a good point. Newspapers edit. Broadcasting at the time when it's live doesn't. Then there's adverts for a book, and then more adverts for your radio sets and things like that as it comes to its conclusion. And there you go. That, my friends, is the Radio Times 100 years ago today. That one, I won't read it entirely because you can read it yourself. Go into shops and buy it. Still got the letter to the editor, still got the listings for 7 days. Doesn't have the chief engineer, doesn't have the general manager, but it does have Carolina Hearn. So, you know, can't be all bad, can it? I do love the Radio Times, and it's marvellous, and I've loved it for 100 years. Well, I haven't loved it for 100 years, but we have as a people. And if you would like more, and you haven't heard it already, we have a 2-part podcast on the history of the Radio Times. Find it where you get podcasts, look for the British Broadcasting Century, and here's to another 100 years, the Radio Times. But there you go. A century ago this week, that was on the air. Patreon.com/Paul Carenza is where you find more videos like this, if you would like them. But and you can support the podcast by doing so because it's a £5 a month and it all goes to fund this bizarre project. Either way, Twitter, Facebook, you can find the British Broadcasting Century, and indeed find the podcast podfollow.com/BB Century or anywhere you get podcasts. Thanks. Add comments if you like. People always like to add comments. I don't know, do they? Add comments, it makes it more interactive and things. Letters to the editor, that's essentially what I'm asking for. And you can also request what you'd like to see in future videos. Maybe I'll do them. What I will show you while I'm here is a couple of other Radio Timeses before we go. This one is from 1941. There you go. I've got all sorts. Oh, hello. That was 1941. And hidden behind it, we had 1938, the Christmas number. 1938. There we go. Thing of beauty, isn't it? Of course, the 1941 Radio Times is very brief because there was a paper ban. You know, they had to preserve the paper. My favourite cover of the Radio Times is that one there. That's just a photograph of it. My favourite because for centuries you had the family gathered round the fire at Christmas, but this, the first Christmas edition, the first colour edition of the Radio Times, the family are turning their backs to the fire and instead facing this new device in the corner. And now, of course, we long for the days where the family gather round any device instead of spreading off to their own rooms. Well, thank you for gathering on this device. Godspeed. Bye-bye.